Dead Space as a series has a strange relationship with genres. The first game was through and through a horror adventure. The second game was a little more complicated, sliding the scale in the other direction. It was a horror game that had a lot of action elements. Dead Space 3 pushed that scale all the way to the other side. It removed most of the atmosphere and horror that the first game presented, and the second game tried to hold on to. It's all the little problems that I had with Dead Space 2, but magnified times 10. It's a completely different tone and style than the previous games, with a lot less substance than before. There's more content here, but the content that can be found is mostly hollow and empty. The game does have its moments, and certain things work through the lens of an action game, but ultimately, it's a frustrating and depressing experience. It's a rough transition, one that almost made me sad playing it. I was wondering how we got here so quickly. How could a fantastic horror title that put atmosphere and immersion at the forefront devolve into this? I want to delve deep into this game because it has a lot of problems outside of just the tone and the genre shift. Today, I'm going to be talking about gameplay, mechanics, story, and everything in between. If you haven't seen any of my previous videos on the Dead Space series, you should probably go watch those now, as it'll give you good context on how the series got to where it is. If you enjoy these videos, you can consider supporting the channel by liking and subscribing, as it really helps me out. You can also subscribe to the Patreon, where I upload text post updates and longer versions of my full retrospectives that YouTube won't let me upload. You can also follow me on Twitch, where I stream games that I'm currently not reviewing. The links to all of these are down in the description. Spoilers for everything Dead Space 3. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I want to talk about Dead Space 3. Dead Space 3 was again developed by Visceral Games and published by Electronic Arts. The game itself was almost cancelled due to the low sales from the previous entry. Instead of canceling the game, they decided to move forward with production but change some things. The team decided to further push the action elements introduced in Dead Space 2. This was done as what they called a necessary evil to increase game sales. The game's director, Ben Wanat, wanted to return the game to its horror roots. EA wasn't so keen on this idea, though. They were more focused on chasing trends and getting the sales up for the series. Fans of the series had been asking for a co-op mode for the next Dead Space. The team's original idea was to include a co-op mode where the other player could control a Shadow Isaac that would appear to be a hallucination. EA rejected this proposal and wanted a more traditional co-op mode, which removed the horror elements. Wanat wanted to focus on the story in this entry, much more than the previous games had. Most of the team knew this entry would be the last, so they wanted to conclude the narrative. Not only that, but they wanted to flesh out the world of the series. This had truly begun in Dead Space 2, with a lot more lore being provided. Dead Space 3 aimed to really give a definitive timeline to the universe. The team again focused on sound design and art. The scenarios and levels were designed more to build tension now, though, rather than an anxiety or horror-driven fear. Overall, it seems the team wanted to make a different game than EA did. This left them with not a lot of options, and eventually they were forced to make a title that would try to capture the market at that time. Dead Space 3 was first announced at E3 2012. The trailer, clearly focusing more on the action and co-op elements, had some fans worried that the series had ditched its horror roots. Dead Space 3 was released in North America for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Microsoft Windows on February 5th, 2013. Dead Space 3 begins with a bit of backstory. This intro cutscene serves as our previously on, but also seeks to flesh out the story around the markers a little further and more definitively. 300 years ago, the black marker was discovered under the Gulf of Mexico on Earth. The details of the disaster that followed were covered up, but Unitology was created around the time, worshipping the marker itself. Humans then fled Earth due to lack of resources. Mankind tried to recreate the markers in an attempt to harness the limitless resources it produced. As we know, this went terrible. The marker copies were buried and forgotten. This is when the USG Ishimura unearthed the red marker on Aegis 7, and the events of Dead Space and subsequently Dead Space 2 took place. Since then, Isaac still has a marker-touched mind, which still has the ability to destroy the markers or build them. The last thing we hear from this section is that there's hope. On an icy planet, years ago, someone managed to stop a marker uprising, which could be the key to stopping them altogether. We begin the prologue on this icy planet, June 18th, 2314. We play this prologue as another character entirely, Tim Kaufman. He's a soldier that's been sent to the planet Tau Volantis to recover a device called the Codex. Kaufman is lost in the snow and finds a wrecked ship. He's attacked by necromorphs that, yes, now have weapons, which, trust me, we'll talk about soon. He finds the Codex and rappels down the side of the mountain. At the bottom, he's confronted by General Mahad. The search for the Codex began because the device could supposedly stop an outbreak in the city. Mahad takes the device, kills Kaufman, deletes the information on the Codex, and takes his own life. The story jumps ahead 200 years to 2514 on the New Horizons lunar colony. Isaac has been living on the colony for the past 3 years, hiding away from EarthGov. He's been living with and dating Ellie Langford from the last game. It seems that has recently ended, though, because we're currently hearing a message from her saying that she's moved on. Just then, Robert Norton and John Carver burst in, telling Isaac that Ellie needs his help for another mission dealing with the markers. Before he can explain, the colony is attacked by unitologists, and the group has to head out. Before we leave, we can find a personal journal of Isaac's, detailing that he lost part of his soul on the Titan Sprawl. Oh, and Ellie also got a replacement for her eye. The soldiers say that they're from the EarthGov's last battalion. We head out towards the escape car and unitologists attack. We have to fight them off. Yes, that's right, we're fighting human enemies in this entry. One of them martyrs themselves, destroying the car and throwing Isaac into a nearby building. The unitologists are specifically looking to kill Isaac, probably because he has the ability to destroy the markers. We're forced to make our way through the sewers and back up onto the streets. Ellie was the one that thought Isaac could stop this grand plan of convergence that the unitologists were planning, but now she's gone missing. Isaac fights through many soldiers, crashes the flow of unmanned transports, and we see a message from Jacob Arthur Danick, the leader of the inner circle of unitologists. He claims the black marker will lift humanity out of its miserable existence, the same things that the cult has been spouting for ages. Danick has gone after EarthGov because they experimented with the markers, which the church consider holy. Isaac is eventually shot by unitologists and captured by Danick. He shows Isaac as he deactivates the security measures in the marker test lab at the center of the colony, wiping most of the settlement out. Before he shoots our protagonist in the head, Isaac escapes and falls down below. We fight off rooms of necromorphs, and eventually Norton contacts us again. Isaac tells him the extraction team is dead. Norton is going to pick up Isaac with the USM Eudora. We solve a very simple train puzzle to get the thing online. We have to run along the train, defeating unitologists as we go, and eventually jump onto the Eudora itself. As you can probably tell so far, Dead Space 3 has a drastically different tone and playstyle to the previous games. We're fighting human enemies. Necromorphs have weapons. We're using cover in the environment. The game has gone full action, and you'll be hard-pressed to find very many actual horror moments in its entire playtime. There are a few spots here and there where it seems they snuck in some small scares or tried their hand at contributing to the atmosphere, but most of that is broken when we're in pseudo-cyberpunk cities jumping on trains and shooting generic soldiers. Dead Space 3 has gone so far in the other direction that it's wild. It's shocking to compare this game, which almost feels like a bland, nameless third-person action game from the early 2010s, to the balanced, interesting, and unique horror masterpiece that was Dead Space. It's a complete bastardization of the original concept of the game. I should note here that I'm not opposed to game series changing their genres throughout. This can be a way to shake up the franchise itself and keep things fresh. It can also be a huge subversion of expectations or a way to break new ground. Not very many series do this. It's not very conventional, but I don't think this was in the favor of trying something new. This was in favor of chasing trends, and you can see it all over the game. On top of the switch to a bland action game, Dead Space 3 also has a multitude of other problems with design and gameplay that we'll surely get into. The bottom line is that Dead Space 3 is barking up the wrong tree. The whole game definitely isn't just generic enemies. We will be fighting necromorphs soon, but this blatant appeal to a wider audience is honestly disrespectful to the franchise itself. I always get worried whenever I'm researching a game and see that the studio wanted to appeal to a wider audience. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but EA's motivation here was clearly to get sales up, not to get more people playing their series, but to appeal to more people. EA would have forced the team to make whatever game they thought would sell at the time. So they took a franchise that they already had and conformed it to the trends in gaming at the time. Isaac wakes up on the Eudora with Carver, who is very blunt. His child and wife were killed by Danik, and it's obvious he wants revenge. We learn from Norton that Ellie and her team shock traveled to another planet that supposedly held the secret to stopping the markers. There's a strange new type of collectible in Dead Space 3, the Artifact. These are virtually just text logs that are given a different name. If you collect all of them, you get the flight suit and an achievement. I wish they would have done a little more with these. Making each artifact unique would have been nice. A lot of games will make each collectible have a story behind it and be a child's toy or a special jacket or something. There's only 4 types of artifacts. In the end, they're really just an incentivized text log, and it's extra odd because text logs also exist in the game. The Eudora shocks into the Tau Volantis system, but they immediately suffer damage from mines and debris around the planet. Isaac has to escape, being thrown around the ship and eventually putting a suit on. We unlock an escape pod and get the crew free, being forced to jet away from the ship, dodging mines and large debris. The pod docks itself on a ship, the CMS Roanoke, that's been mostly obliterated. As they arrive, they're getting a signal from Ellie, an SOS deep inside the ship. Isaac decides to seek it out. When Isaac gets inside, he finds a bench and we're introduced to the overhauled weapon system. Before we get too much further into the story, I'd like to talk about the combat and weapons of Dead Space 3, because there's a lot of changes to the system overall. First of all, as we've talked about before, necromorphs have weapons. I'm not really in favor of this change overall. The necromorphs that do have weapons feel cheap, generic, and bland. The first time I saw them, it just felt like they were pulled from some other franchise, one that deals primarily with zombies. Their appearance, for the most part, also removes quite a lot of the interest in design that existed in the previous games. A lot of the praise for the enemy designs in Dead Space originated from the fact that they were alien in nature, grotesque humans that had been warped, and a complete distortion of the human form. Now, not every necromorph looks like a basic human enemy, and some of the basic human ones with weapons will also transform into things like a pair of legs with spiked appendages sprouting from the top. I just think the presentation for a lot of this game is pretty generic. We also have to face human enemies now, which we talked about previously. Much of the systems have stayed pretty much the same. We still have kinesis, which will allow us to grab objects and manipulate or throw them. This is used mostly for puzzles in this game, and I didn't find much use for it in combat. Stasis, on the other hand, is basically a must-have when playing through the entirety of Dead Space 3. Enemies are much faster in this entry, and slowing them down is paramount to surviving the massive hordes of necromorphs that we'll face. Other than that, the bench system has been greatly overhauled. We no longer just place nodes into circuits to upgrade stats on our weapons. Now we have a whole crafting system at our disposal. This is actually surprisingly intricate and was one of my favorite parts of the game. Here we can craft entirely new items, either from pre-planned blueprints or by combining parts that we found out in the wild. These can create all kinds of wild combinations. We can add modifiers to each weapon to determine how much or what kind of damage it does, like acid or flame. Certain attachments can even increase the power of our stasis or recharge our health. We can also add circuits to each of our weapons to increase the damage, reload, clip, or rate of fire. Some of these can have drawbacks though, decreasing other stats in the process. Each weapon is split into an upper and lower half, the upper being the primary fire and the lower half being the secondary fire. We can create line guns with a flamethrower as the secondary fire or any combination you can think of. It's actually a pretty interesting system once you get the hang of it. The only problem I found with it is that it was incredibly unintuitive. I didn't understand from the get-go how this all worked. This isn't the fault of the tutorial, because even if something walked me through the whole system, I still think it would have taken me some time to understand. The way the UI is set up, which for the record looks god-awful, makes everything seem pretty confusing and difficult to understand until you actually begin using it. The only downside to this whole thing is that we're downgraded to 2 weapons in this entry instead of 4. I mostly used the plasma cutter with a secondary fire of the flamethrower. This thing was pretty reliable the whole time, and being able to switch to the flamethrower in a pinch when I was overwhelmed helped out a lot. My other weapon switched out quite a bit, but was mostly a shotgun with an acid attachment that burned enemies after shooting them. This whole system creates a large amount of variety in each playthrough, depending on what weapons you choose to fight off the necromorph horde. The only negative thing I have to say is that I just wish this system was in a better game. We can still put upgrades to our health, stasis, armor, and rig by entering a suit kiosk. This is closer to the original bench that we've become accustomed to from the first 2 games. We use resources to upgrade nodes, increasing our health, armor, or different attributes dealing with our kinesis or stasis. We can switch suits in this entry, but they're strictly cosmetic, not providing the attributes that they did in previous games. We make our way through the ship and eventually find the generator room. The SOS is coming from right above, but we have to activate the machine itself first. We have to use kinesis to interact with the machine on 3 sides, all while dealing with enemies rushing at us. Upstairs, we reunite with Ellie and Norton, only to realize they're in a relationship. We also meet Santos and Buckle, who are a part of Ellie's team. Ellie says that the admiral of the ship had written marker scrawls all over her walls, and she thinks the answer to this situation is in her cabin. Ellie calls shortly after, and Isaac confronts her about her relationship with Norton. He objects, but he doesn't have a choice. He has to work with them. We enter another room where we have to complete the same generator puzzle as before, but now with tentacles involved. There's a few different hacking puzzles in Dead Space 3. I guess they were trying to diversify their electronics interface. The first one we encounter sees us having to move either analog stick to different spots of the board and holding the triggers to activate circuits in time. It's a small upgrade in puzzle variety, but nothing that I have too many feelings about. Isaac arrives at the Admiral's cabin and meets up with Carver, but Isaac gets lost in the scrawlings.
Ellie, Carver, reach the Admiral's quarters. Isaac's.
Turn it off.
Hey, Isaac!
Turn it
Isaac?
off.
Carver, what's going on?
Turn it off.
Isaac!
Turn
Hey!
it off. Turn it off.
Hey!
What is it? What's going on?
Nothing. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. Ellie, the Admiral was obsessed with making a key.
A key to what?
Hey! A key to what?
Some sort of alien device.
The Admiral discovered a key to a device that could control the markers. Ellie thinks that Tau Volantis is the marker homeworld and wants to regroup in the control room. Norton wants to leave, but Ellie protests, wanting to head to Tau Volantis. We encounter Ellie again, and she's found a maintenance shuttle that could get them off the ship. Norton contacts Isaac to try and get him on his side, to try and convince the team to leave the system. Isaac finds the small maintenance shuttle that allows him to travel quickly to different parts of the system. This introduces a new concept to the Dead Space world, a pseudo-open world design. We'll see some results of this new design later, but we do have a certain control over where we go in the game, at least for the beginning portion of it. We get our first side quest here, one of 10 in total, 3 of which are relegated to co-op, and 7 of which can be done solo. These side missions are not a terrible idea overall, especially for an action game, but their execution is pretty poor. For me to talk about the side missions, I first have to talk about the way that Dead Space 3 handles enemies. One of the worst parts of Dead Space 3 was how it handled enemy encounters. They take a ridiculous amount of time. Especially large groups of enemies will see us standing in a spot, defeating tons of waves, and then waiting endlessly for more to trickle in. The game just throws waves and waves of necromorphs at us. We might even think the battle is over at specific points, but most of the time, we're wrong. There are more enemies that are going to come through the vents, the windows, the maintenance shafts. Most large combat encounters see us standing at one end of the room waiting for more enemies to come at us, defeating those, and waiting for more. It's a ridiculous amount of enemies, and I'm honestly not sure why they upped the amount this much. Because the variety in enemy types hasn't really increased, it really makes each enemy type feel generic and overused. We see the same enemies so many times, even in each area. They get tired and trite. It's an incredible overusage of the necromorphs, and before, I never thought I could get tired of these enemy designs, but here we are. One other nitpick that I have about the combat system, now that we're on that subject, is that the ammo has been incredibly simplified. No longer is there separate ammo for each weapon in the game. Every type of ammo that we pick up is just called ammo clip by the game. This ammo works for all weapons across the board. I'm sure this was a lazy way of making ammunition work with their new weapon crafting system, but they definitely could have separated ammo into different types, considering there's only a certain amount of cores that you can use for your weapons, determining what type of ammunition they would fire. It's just a really lazy way of simplifying the game overall, and is a significant downgrade in my opinion. Now that we've established how enemy encounters, especially large ones, are conducted, we can talk about side quests. Side quests are pretty formulaic. You usually get a key or some sort of text log that directs you to a place that holds some sort of cache. This means extra ammunition or upgrade materials. Entering this area will see us finding most of this side story through text logs or audio communications, and it's generally the same thing across the board. Some sort of organization has been infiltrated by the necromorphs, and they left behind equipment that we can salvage. We make our way through the area and eventually have to fight off waves and waves of enemies before getting it. The only reason I brought up the generic way that the game handles enemy waves before is because side quests are where it's at its worst. These final rooms before we get our loot is most of the time where we're inundated with waves and waves of the same enemies over and over, just causing us to shoot and shoot repeatedly, standing in the same corner for 10 minutes until we can get our reward. The whole thing feels very hollow and uninspired. We eventually head onto the Terra Nova, a derelict ship that contains a shuttle. Isaac tries to retrieve the shuttle because it can take them down to the planet's surface. Isaac locates the shuttle inside the ship. It's in the aft station. While traversing the station, we find our first scavenger pod. These are little tools that we can place around different areas to scrounge up resources for us. They can only be placed in certain spots, though. We'll hear an audio cue when heading through an area and be able to place the bot. After a while, we can pick the bot back up at the bench and get some resources from it, which allows us to craft more weapons, items, or upgrades for our suit. I didn't really like this addition that much. It felt odd and out of place in a Dead Space game. I don't mind the crafting system, but I'm not sure why the focus was on resource collecting while I'm supposed to be saving the world. We have to complete a simple puzzle to get the tram back into the ship. We encounter our first Hunter, another version of the Ubermorph from the second game, or the Hunter from the first game. These enemies regenerate limbs, and again we have to deal with them by cutting off their appendages and hitting them with stasis so that we can get away. We eventually escape the thing and get the tram working so that we can find the shuttle on the ship. The shuttle isn't in flying condition though, and we need to take it back to the repair bay. First, we have to make a remote relay. We have to find multiple pieces for the relay and craft it using a bench. Unfortunately, the ship is out of fuel, so we have to head to the refueling station. Here, Isaac fuels the ship, but Ellie accidentally started the launch sequence, and we have to get out before we're burned to death. On top of that, we have to get the shuttle bay doors open before the shuttle itself launches. Some gas canisters get caught in the gears for the shuttle door, and we have to use a turret to blow them up while also mowing down waves of necromorphs. The thing explodes and we're spit out of the ship, but the shuttle has made it out and is heading to the repair bay. The shuttle is missing its engine, but luckily we find a new one from wreckage floating out in space. We have to find 3 flight recorders as well from satellites floating in the wreckage of the Terra Nova. This lets us craft a nav module for the shuttle itself. Norton still wants to take the shuttle and leave, but Ellie is convinced that they can stop the markers on the planet below. Isaac makes his way back to the shuttle. He tells Ellie that they have to leave now. We have to pilot the ship through space, shooting mines out of the air while avoiding debris. There's so many moments like this in Dead Space 3, and it really overall feels more like a blockbuster action movie than a horror game. Like I said in my video about Dead Space, one of my only issues with the game was the turret sections, and this game feels like it has so many of its own version of turret sections. The group is forced to crash land on the planet after making contact with too much debris. Isaac wakes up in the wreckage of the ship, separated from the group. We have a new meter to worry about on the planet, our body temperature. I thought this was a neat little mechanic that I actually appreciated and felt more like a survival horror mechanic. Our temperature will drop when walking in the snow, but we can raise it by getting close to the fires burning in the snow. If we let it get to 0, we freeze to death. I thought this mechanic was an interesting addition, but it's swiped away from us pretty soon after this. We get an upgraded suit that's made for the cold weather, and we just don't have to deal with it anymore. Isaac is tossed down the mountain but can't seem to get in contact with Ellie over comms. We traverse through the cold and eventually find an old comms station, but we still can't reach Ellie. We get inside a building to find Buckle, who is freezing to death. He said the rest of the group got snowsuits, but he couldn't find another. Just then, he succumbs to the cold. We explore the station and get a suit that resists the cold, removing any trace of that cold mechanic for the rest of the game. We find a trail of flares that Ellie and her crew left, and following them leads us to Carver atop a balcony. Before we can rendezvous to him, he gets attacked by necromorphs. Ellie and her crew are alive, but Isaac has to get to them. We encounter the Snow Beast, a new necromorph that will fight multiple times over the course of the game. I really hate this boss. I think it's poorly designed, and I'll tell you why. This is really the only time in the whole game that I felt it necessary to use the new roll feature that Dead Space 3 introduces. The Dead Space series was never one that really needed a roll function, but this boss will rush us, so we have to use it. The boss itself is pretty simple. It has 3 tentacles on its back, which we have to sever to reveal pods that we can then damage. We have to destroy the 3 pods it reveals by severing its tentacles 3 times. It's not a very complex boss overall, but boy, its attacks are insane. This boss really only has one attack, to rush at Isaac and knock him down. You'd think that this would follow some sort of pattern, but it really doesn't. Sometimes the boss will attack once in between you dismembering its tentacles. Sometimes it'll attack you 3 times in a row while you're still down, completely draining your health. It's wildly unpredictable, and I don't think it's to add challenge or complexity to the fight. I think it's purely poor design. On top of that, the tentacles on the left and right of the boss can't be attacked half the time because the creature's front legs are in the way. You can't really get around the boss to attack these side tentacles, and you also can't attack the tentacles after dodging a rush attack because its tentacles are put away when it rushes you. You just have to keep firing and hope the tentacles peek out and you get lucky. I want to be clear here, this boss isn't difficult, it's just frustrating. There's a large difference between the two. You know when a boss is frustrating when you can actively feel that you aren't the reason you're getting hit, but the game itself is the reason. Eventually we defeat it and it runs away. We rendezvous with the team and Ellie hugs Isaac, which clearly Norton isn't happy with. Santos thinks she's found the machine that they're looking for. There's a signal that's coming from the other end of the complex that can help them get to the machine itself. This whole game just feels really odd. There's something I can't quite place, but everything just feels off. It's almost like they don't understand why people were interested in Dead Space in the first place. The game just feels hollow, and we're seeing the same characters, we're seeing the same enemies, we're seeing markers, but it just doesn't feel like Dead Space. Probably because it isn't. This is some weird version of Dead Space that EA thought would sell more copies. It's times like these when I think back to that interview with Glenn Schofield. Listening to him talk about the first game like it was his baby, a masterpiece that he spent his life working towards, his shining moment. And now it's this, some hollow franchise that's being propped up by EA to try and figure out how to make it profitable. which is strange because Dead Space was never profitable in the first place. Outside, Danik and the unitologists arrive and begin to attack Isaac and the group. Isaac eventually finds the signal, which turns out to be a giant frozen necromorph. It emits signals which can be traced back to the machine. We eventually thaw the thing by activating machines around it. Santos finds a blueprint for a probe gun that we need to trace the signals to the machine. We gather the parts for the probe gun and eventually face the snow beast again. It runs away once more when we defeat it. We eventually craft the probe gun and take a cage that transports us inside of the frozen beast. Here we have to follow a signal and shoot probes into different parts of the Nexus. This of course triggers tons of the pack to come and attack us. After fending them off, Ellie says that tons of signals have come through with the probes. Below the planet's surface is where they head to. This must be where the machine is located. Once outside of the Nexus, Norton decides to leave us in the cage and take control of the mission. He heads off to save Ellie. Luckily, we have kinesis and can get out anyways. Isaac is bombarded once exiting the compound. Norton and Carver have been captured by Danik, who reveals that Norton was working with them. The crew overtakes the men before they're killed. Isaac tries to blow Danik up with a grenade, but he gets away. The Nexus is then awake and we have to fight it. We have to shoot various pods to damage it and try to not get eaten, but eventually we do. Inside the Nexus, we have to destroy more pods while avoiding red projectiles volleyed at us. Norton turns on Isaac, blaming him for getting them into this trouble. Norton says he tried to save them and turns his gun on Isaac, but we have the quicker trigger finger. Isaac tries to explain to Ellie what happened, but she's in shock, and the rest of the group are starting to lose hope. Luckily, Santos has found some information about a device called the Codex and something called the Rosetta that's in a nearby lab. We make our way up the mountain, doing tons of rappelling in the process, which Dead Space 3 just loves. I hated a lot of these sequences, especially later in the game. They become pretty challenging, and not because you're trying to overcome the odds that the game throws at you, but because you're trying to interface with the clunky controls. We get a cargo elevator activated, and Santos gets attacked by the snow beast. Carver decides to sacrifice her to save themselves. We have to frustratingly face the snow beast one final time. We destroy it by impaling it with harpoons and rip it in half. Isaac reunites with Ellie and apologizes to her for everything, and they're about to rekindle their relationship before Carver cuts them off. In the lab, they find out that Rosetta is an alien that's been cut into multiple different pieces. Her brain contains information about the markers that they need. We have to travel across the lab, finding different pieces and sending them back to the lab. Once there, we reassemble them. Activating the pieces of Rosetta causes Isaac to have a vision of an alien civilization long ago that discovered a marker. After the ensuing necromorphs took over, a convergence event began. This transferred the organic matter from the planet to create a necromorph moon. The moon is the actual source of the marker symbol. The machine that the aliens built froze the planet and stopped the convergence from happening. Just then, Danik arrives and takes the Codex, which is the key to turning the machine off. The room fills with gas as Isaac leaves and Ellie is trapped inside. Isaac is enraged and he and Carver pursue Danik and his soldiers to try and stop this, but also for Isaac to get his personal revenge on him. We find Danik descending on a large elevator into the planet himself. We have to repel and defeat soldiers shooting at us along the way. Eventually, we have to get inside the planet itself to seek out the alien civilization. We're confronted with multiple panels here that operate using an alien language. We have to use environmental clues to figure out which symbols to input into the machine. Inside, we find the alien machine that's holding off the convergence. We have to make our way through the alien civilization. Here, we're introduced to amp pads. These are circles on the ground which we can stand on and will power up our kinesis and stasis abilities. These are paramount in the last couple of chapters of the game because we'll need powerful stasis to keep the hordes of necromorphs at bay. We'll also be able to use jump pads to transport us to different areas of the alien city. To get to the machine, we have to interact with multiple different alien puzzles, most of which are pretty simple, and finally unlock the core itself. Eventually, Danik calls us and tells us that Ellie is still alive, to draw us in. I really don't like this plot point. I'm not sure what the purpose of killing Ellie off was, if she was just going to be revealed to still be alive through a comms call. It's pretty odd, and I feel like they should have just kept her alive and have her get captured by Danik. There's not really a good reason to have the death fake out in there. Isaac already had enough motivation to want to stop the markers in the first place. We eventually get inside the core with the codex in hand. Danik is going to kill Ellie if we don't get him the device. Carver hands the codex over to Danik to save Ellie, and Danik stops the machine. The necromorph moon begins to consume the planet itself. The fate of the entire world is now at stake. Danik is killed by a piece of collapsing rubble. Carver tries to stop the machine himself, but Isaac insists that he go with him. Isaac sends Ellie off with a smooch, giving her the cut-in-half picture of himself. We have to run across pieces of debris and fly through space. Eventually, we face the moon, which is a giant, massive necromorph. We have to use kinesis to shoot markers at its eyes while fending off smaller necromorphs on our platform. We eventually destroy it, and Isaac removes the codex. Carver and Isaac are both whisked away as the moon begins to crash into Tau Volantis. Isaac looks at Ellie's picture as he floats into oblivion. Ellie is mourning Isaac on the shuttle. She can't get any response from him, but she doesn't detect the marker signal. The threat has finally been stopped. She heads back to Earth, leaving Tau Volantis in the past. After the credits, we find out that Isaac is still alive as we briefly hear him call out to Ellie. Before we get to my final thoughts on the game, I'd like to briefly talk about the Dead Space 3 DLC, Awaken. This was another short DLC, this time centering around Isaac and Carver. I haven't talked about this until now, but Dead Space 3 has a co-op function that allows you to play the game with another person. One person plays Isaac and the other person plays Carver. This is the same for the DLC. I briefly played the co-op and it's not too bad. There's really not too much to say about it other than the fact that it's the same game but with another person. There is some extra functionality, like certain weapons that can be crafted to heal each other or attachments that can fill both players' stasis modules. The person playing as Carver will actually see different things at certain points in the game, which brings its own problems for the main story, especially when playing solo. It's alright, and I can see how some people would have fun with this. Even bad games can be good with friends. The story sees Isaac and Carver waking up after the events of Dead Space 3. They're in an underground cave and have learned that the Brethren moons have awakened. These are large necromorph moons, because, yeah, we're just there now, that are heading straight for Earth. Isaac and Carver try to get the Terra Nova working so they can head back to Earth and warn them of the coming threat, maybe even stopping the whole thing. Once they get back to Earth, they realize the moons have already arrived and one of them crashes into the Terra Nova. I'm not sure what the entire point of this DLC was other than to make more money. I'm assuming it was to set up another game in the series because Isaac and Carver were already basically dead at the end of the base game. Why bring them back, introduce a new threat, and then basically kill them again in the DLC? I guess you could make the case that they were supposed to live and Dead Space 4 could have been them fending off the Brethren moons from Earth, but as you know by now, Dead Space 4 never happened. Dead Space overall isn't a great end to the series. It's a game that tried to redirect the entire course of the franchise. It sought to course correct the series because in EA's mind, they weren't getting enough sales, and chasing trends would get them those sales. They figured if they did what everyone else were doing at the time, that people would follow. In this, they forgot a major aspect of why people wanted to see Dead Space games in the first place, because they were unique. My interest in the first Dead Space game and the series overall was because of its unique take on horror. It was an interesting blend of genres that really hadn't been explored yet. It felt distinct yet familiar. It was a new horizon that I felt had plenty of stories to be told. In the end, EA decided to force the developers to take this interesting and unique idea and conform it to whatever trends were popular at the time. It's interesting because if Dead Space 3 was forced to come out today, it might be a wildly different game because the motivations behind it are dynamic. It's a game that seems out of place. Its story is strange and almost unnecessary. It feels out of place in the series and the gaming scene overall. It feels like one of those generic games that would have come out in the early 2010s. It doesn't feel like it's doing anything special. It also completely misunderstands why people like the series in the first place. EA was trying to widen the audience of the series they had created, but they didn't realize that by trying to widen the audience, they were actually alienating their core fan base. Instead of introducing the game to a wider audience, they narrowed the amount of people that would actually want to play their game. Dead Space 3 still received surprisingly positive reviews. It holds a 78 out of 100 on the Xbox 360 version of the game. Reviewers specifically liked the change to the action genre and felt that the new style was something to be welcomed. Certain publications felt like the story dragged and the grandiose narrative let down the story overall. Dead Space 3 eventually reached number 1 on the sales charts for the UK, but sold 20% less than Dead Space 2. EA considered it another failure, an entry into the list of failures that were the series of Dead Space. We've only covered the mainline entries in the Dead Space series, but there are many other pieces of media that we need to go over, including books, animated movies, comics, and spin-off games. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad.